Well, so far, this number 2, these talks have been They were designed for, I thought 10 or 15 students would come and they could talk about these things. And it was the sole reason was to get my act into order for a book that I couldn't get out at all because there was so much material sprawled all over the place. So, I haven't said a thing yet that's going in the book. This is the way it goes. If I have a pencil, we can begin. Let's see. Now, the last time, in order to remove otherwise insurmountable obstacles to any serious discussion of facsimile number 2, if some of you will remember, in the Book of Abraham, it was necessary to point out that scholarship is not always what it should be or pretends to be. Now it's time for a more positive approach, in which we behold a recent and marked change of direction in the study of Egyptian religion. I would say just since the 1980s, most of it. This is the change that has taken place. So we've got to go into some things here. This has not been a result of new documentary discoveries or new excavations at all. The stuff's been there all the time. It's the reconsideration of the basic works, almost every one of which we have in the BYU library. Not only have in the BYU library, but have the first editions, thanks to good old Brother Mercer. Practically gave us all that stuff, and it's extremely valuable. And when you say, well, what, that old stuff? Yes, it's old, and it's being viewed with a new respect today. For one thing, it's by no means all funeral stuff, not at all. Though you find it in tombs and with mummies, much of it was included by scribes and priests in the funeral text. See, they sold them. It was mass production. They sold them. The buyer would never read the text. He was dead anyway. And his family wasn't going to take trouble with it, so they did anything to fill out space and beautiful drawings and so forth. And after all, it was sort of relevant, but it did make it possible to up the price of these manuscripts, were produced in large numbers by shops and sold on the open market. And as for what is funereal and what is not, you can well imagine an excavator in the far future saying, well, he excavates down in Mantyre, someplace like that, and finds that we have these strange robes. Obviously, these robes are designed for funeral rites. They were designed for burial. Well, they weren't for that at all. They were for temple, you see. But they're not out of place in the way we use them. It's the same way with these manuscripts. They don't have to be designed for funerals to be completely relevant to the subject, because in religion you can't draw the line, of course, between the contemplation of life and death. Well, it's the presence of death alone, you see, that forces us all to confront the basic problem of religion, which I've been yelling about the last 2 years or so. But I've been calling the terrible question. Religion exists for one purpose only, which is not moral or ethical or aesthetic or philosophical or humanistic or psychological or historical, etc., all of which are nicely taken care of in their own special departments. Its calling is to answer one question and one question only, which the priesthood and the ministry avoid like the plague, namely, is this all there is? They want to, if there's no other world, no afterlife, religion doesn't mean a thing. Well, since the positivists consider that question already definitively answered for all time, the answer is no, of course. Anyone's absurd, a child, you think, who believes that stuff. So they've impetuously pushed it all aside, as we saw the last time. They have actually contempt for the Egyptian religious literature. Shortly after, well, let me give you a rundown on this briefly on the nature of our sources here. I say we have them all here, and it's quite something to have them. It's, after all, practically only a skeleton library, practically, but what a skeleton, so you can build the other stuff around it. Shortly after cracking the code of the Rosetta Stone in 1822, Champollion, I think it was 24, visited the museums at Geneva and at Turin, and he found 2 manuscripts there that were very much alike, compared them, and to this writing, he decided, well, this must be one document, it must be Egyptian, but gave it a title called The Grand Funeral Ritual, the Great Funeral Ritual, or The Funeral Ritual. They thought the Book of the Dead was the rite for funerals. But it was more carefully studied, and in 1842, Richard Lepsius still based on the great Turin manuscript, gave it the name of Das Totenbuch der Alten Ägypter, the Book of the Dead of the Ancient Egyptians, which we still have. And that's this one here. We're lucky. This is show and tell. Our library has this. This is that first edition, the first publication ever of the Book of the Dead, and it's Lepsius' own 1842. Not only that, but this particular copy belonged to Kurt Seithe, the greatest modern Egyptologist. I think without any doubt, as far as the language and culture is concerned, he's done more than anyone else. This was his own copy. He had it on the open shelves in the book at BYU here. I shouldn't tell these things. If it was back again, we'd be missing it by Monday, just as sure as anything. But no, I'm not fooling, not by any means. But this is that work, and it's the first Book of the Dead, the first important Egyptian manuscript ever published, and very early, you see, in 42. He first considered it a sort of church record of burials, but then later decided it was a passport to the beyond, and that's been a popular way of designating it. Well, it was translated into English in 1867 by Samuel Birch, and then into German in 1872, in French, the Computer's translation, Carré, in 1882. At that time, they thought it was considerably older, because the text they had, these texts here, and it's a beautiful reproduction, vignettes and all, they thought it was 26th dynasty at the latest, and it wasn't. It was the 26th dynasty around 600. That's Lehi's dynasty, you see. It was much later. It was Ptolemaic and Roman. Then in 1874, at the Second International Congress of Orientalists in London, they decided they would get all the manuscripts they could find of this, put them together, and see if they could make a unified work out of it, see what it was about, because it was a big thing. This was it. They were after a unified text, and they soon discovered that the manuscripts now available were far too large to handle. They were able to find this turning up everywhere. So at the conference the next time, in 1878, 4 years later, in Florence, they decided to stick just to the manuscripts from the Theban cemetery, where the Joseph Smith stuff comes from, and from the 18th to 20th dynasties, the earliest ones. That takes it back quite early, you see, 1500. Of which they used 71 different exemplars. So that's quite a few manuscripts to compare, find out if they're all the same. And this great work, which is still the standard work, came out in 1886, and we also have that. That's this one. This is working. Is this working? Oh, good. Then we have to get back there. We just opened it at random, you see. And this is the way they did it. I'll just leave it there. This is it's the 3 volumes. It was edited by Naville. I should have said who he had working with. It was a committee with no less a person than Samuel Birch and Chabas and Lepsius worked on it, and the Swiss Egyptologist Edward Naville edited it. But you see what they do here? They arrange the different texts, the texts side by side, and they don't all read alike. Most of the time they do, some of the time they don't. From this, you put them all together, 71 manuscripts, and you finally get a uniform text. Well, we're lucky having this here. If you're going to do study on the Book of the Dead, this is the one you must have, and needless to say, it has not come out in paperback, be sold at bus stations or anything like that. It's very hard to get. But you just look at it at random here. Yes. They use different things. Thereupon, I go up. He says, I mount up as a hawk here, but in the other one he says, I mount up. No mention of a hawk at all. You haven't seen that's the sort of difference you have. The little things like that, and then here he says, Yertepro, the creation of things, the making of things that are, but that's omitted from most of them, and it'll be different here. Anyway, means the effluences from the mummy and so forth. Well, you compare those and you find out what it is. You don't need to do a lot of stuff with that. Well, And then what happens? When it first became known, this mysterious book, you see, they really lagged on to this. This was the Egyptian Bible. This was the book that will tell us the secrets of the ancients and so forth. They were soon very much disappointed by it. Well, incidentally, I should mention this. With all those characters there, have we finally decided what it means? What this book is about? No, not at all. The last time I was going to read you some snatches of translations by the two latest, well, not two latest, by T.J. Allen, or the two most important recent translations, and Eric Hornum. Read the two side by side, and you wouldn't recognize them as the same book at all. There's no agreement on what this says or what it means. Not yet. Well, here we are, still hung up there, and now they finally decided to come, because they wouldn't touch religion with a 40-foot pole. Now they've got to think of it that way. So this mysterious book was hailed as the Bible of the Egyptians. But when its contents became known more fully, they looked capricious, disconnected. One line says it's Re, and the other line says it's Tem, the same thing. Well, what are we talking about? Which one? And others will say Chnum right in the same part. They're shifting names around. They're moving all over the place. What's going on here? So they lost interest. There's lots of glamour, except for the occultists and the end of the 19th century, the theosophists. They all make a big thing of it, as you know. And their enthusiasm only turned the professional Egyptologies more and more against it. But what really cast it into the shadow was in 1880, the pyramid texts, the Saqqara, were discovered. Now, they take up much less. I have my own copy of them, a couple of big volumes and so forth. But they're a full 1,000 years older. The Saqqara, I thought I had a picture of Saqqara there, but I noticed it isn't. A full 1,000 years older, and it's talking about the same sort of things, but in a different way. And they showed that these passages here have been corrupted, have been falsified, have been misunderstood. There's one standard translation of this, and that's Seta's again. It's the only one that exists, standard edition, as well as translation of this, and that's Seta's, though in 1971, Faulkner made a translation too. Seta was in 1894, so here we are. And no complete translations of the Book of the Dead have appeared since then. The enticing vignettes have received very little attention, and the text of chapter 151, now that's a Kabbalistic coincidence, isn't it? Room 151, inside the mask, the golden mask of King Tut, is written the 151st chapter of the Book of the Dead. And would you realize that's never been published? It's a different text. It's never been photographed. It's never been printed. How strange after all these years. That's how little interest there is in the Book of the Dead, or has been. And then, quite late in 1912, they started studying the coffin texts. Those are the coffin texts, the great nobles of the Middle Kingdom, after 2000, and they're written painted on the boards of the coffins in which these lords were buried, some on the bottom, some on the sides, and so forth. And these were the coffin texts. They come earlier. And they're known much later, beginning to appear in 1912. And there's only one edition of them, only one. We have that too. There's 7 volumes to become 11. The 7 volumes by Debuk from 1935 to 1961. I could have brought those all over for show and tell too. And again, you see, since there are lots and lots of coffins, there are lots and lots of texts all in a row, and you decide yourself which is the best one to follow, and which is the best to follow, and how you can get a standard text out of it. Well, after many years of stalling, things have started to move again. The funeral literature has been taken seriously by a number of scholars, and is making sense. Sometimes, writes Eric Hornum, one comes upon the opinion in the literature that the Egyptians had completed their great original achievement in the field of religion with the pyramid texts, see, that break off with the Old Kingdom, in the 6th dynasty of Saqqara there. And all the later texts and concepts are only mindless repetition or corruption, that's all, of this ancient spiritual heritage. That's not so at all, but where did we get that idea? Well, I would suggest that no one has bothered to ask the basic question that would really make things fall into place if we ask this, and this is what they've done now, and things do fall into place. Well, you notice, for Mormons reading this stuff, you hear familiar echoes and reverberations all over the place. You ask, well, is this legitimate? Is this really all right? Well, you see why the professors shy away from it like they're frightened of it. They won't touch it. This is especially so. You couldn't get, as you call, you couldn't get into a discussion on these things. Well, they wouldn't mention it, would have anything to do with it. Because of that, but there may be a connection, you say, and how do you know if the connection is significant? Well, this is the question anyway. The problem is, the question is, what is the problem here? What's the problem they're trying to solve? They're all exercised about the same thing. They're always talking about the same sort of things, always using the same jargon, using these same odd figures, throwing them together in different combinations. What are they trying to get at? They'd ask that seriously then. Things begin, I say, to fall into place. For the present-day scholars of Egyptology, all recognize that there is one overriding issue and obsession, and it's naturally what would be the obsession of people being buried and so forth, that idea of the afterlife. And in the first place, as we've often been told, the Egyptian loved life. That's apparent all over the place, after all, and he had no desire to lose it. Wherever we go in Egypt, lots of slides about this, you see, in palace or temple or tomb, what do you see? The great Ankh symbol, the crux ansata, the symbol of life. We use it in jewelry here and so forth. But life is their obsession, of course. You see that everywhere. He wanted to go on living forever, and almost as pervasive as the symbols of life are those of eternity. The jet and the ring with a flat thing under it like that, that's the Shem or infinity symbol, eternity symbol. You see that everywhere too. You see the life symbols everywhere and the eternities, and they're usually together. Well, you can draw your conclusions from that, of course. And what's more, he wanted a personal, eternal existence, the kind Brigham Young talks about. Careful to state, you know that because in his tomb he's careful to, almost all Egyptians, those that can afford it, those that can't have it on papyrus, he's careful to state his full name, his rank, his address, his parentage, his descendants. He gives his genealogy, names his father and mother, wife and offspring and so forth. He gives all his offices, all his titles, all his dignity. He always supplies him with a portrait of him and his family. He wants to be identified as an individual. That. He's not going to be a drop of water absorbed in an ocean of being, not that mysticism at all. And he quotes at length all his awards, and I say he quotes letters of recommendation from the Pharaoh or from other high authorities. Not content, as I say, with becoming a drop of water, he wanted to go on enjoying himself as himself at various levels, and it's common in hundreds of steles found at the entrance to tombs. You see the three levels of picture, and you see him enjoying himself in the lower world, in the middle, and in the upper world. At all three levels, he's having a good time wherever he is, and it's always himself. His name is always given, his wife is always with him, and his children are all there too. So you see what kind of a future they're looking forward to. It's nothing mystical or hocus pocus here. But how does he achieve this very tangible condition of everlasting joy? In the first place, he must deserve it, and he knows that. And so he's constantly telling us the things he had to do to earn not only the position of Yimach, which means venerated state, venerated by those who come to the tomb after, in people's remembrance, but far more important is the eternal bliss and exaltation of being an Ach in the world of light and glory on high with the blessed spirits, with all his family and so forth. But now we come to the real problem. How is he going to manage the great and yawning gulf? He's got to get over there, the fearful passage to the beyond. The point is that he's got to keep it real. These are hard-headed realists, these Egyptians here, and spiritualizing just won't do. This is the problem of which scholars have most recently addressed their attention. What is, they call it, the Verewigungstechnique, a special technique, a special science, and it is a science. Well, how can this be arranged that this would physically take place? Well, from our side, we can't manage it, but it can be managed from the other side if we make the proper arrangements, they say. I'm tempted this time, since he's shown with his family and so forth, to read you some things from the coffin text. I'll read you just one spell from the coffin text that shows you the kind of things they're obsessed with. There are a number of these here. There are a dozen or so. I'm going to read this one, which should be the good one here. All right, I'll read this one. This is called Assembling the Family, Father, Mother, Friends, Associates, Children, Women, Concubines, Servants, Workers, and everything belonging to a man for him in the realm of the dead. And then it starts. Assembling a man's family for him in the realm of the dead. O Re, O Atom, O Geb, O Nut. CN, that's the person's name. CN goes down into the sky. He goes down into the earth. He goes down into the water, seeking his family, seeking his father and mother, seeking his children and brethren, seeking his loved ones, seeking his friends, seeking his associates and his servants who worked for him. And you can see why this was such a stable and enduring society, because they felt so interdependent on each other, and there was great love among them. This is a thing that comes out very clearly. And seeking, because N, that's his name again, is you whom the great ones created. They are assembled, there are assembled for me and my children, for N and his children, and his concubine, whom N's heart has accepted. They are assembled for N, his servants, who worked for him on earth. If there is delay or prevented or impending from giving his father to N and releasing his mother to him and assembling his family for him, his father and mother, his men and women, if this be delayed or prevented or impeded in any way, the assembly of his children, the assembling of the children for his brethren, his loved ones, his friends, his associates, his servants who worked for him on earth, his staff, shall be taken away from Re. We shall withhold our favor from Re. He says there'll be hard feelings here. Then he says, but if N's father be given to him, if his mother be released for him, if there be assembled for N his family, his fathers, his mothers, his men, his women, his children, his loved ones, his friends, his associates, his children and concubines, whom his heart has accepted, his servants who worked for him on earth, if there be assembled for N his family who are in heaven or on earth, who are in the necropolis, who are in the abyss, who are in the place, you're going to have to bring them from down under and bring them up. So they're going to do the work for him, and it refers to this here, about the records here, about the great field. Yes, we're in the place of mourning. Then, now his sister Moon, who was in charge of the great field, wait, this is one. The great ones then surrounding gone down joyfully in their hearts happily at the prospect of meeting. Now here is the happy meeting on the other side. We intend to meet our family there. Now when sister, the woman who is in charge of the great field, says, see, he's coming. You have come joyfully, happy-hearted. So he says, and answer. He says, answer me. Has there been granted you a decree for his family of you? N has gone down rejoicing and happy-hearted, for his family is given to him. They're waiting for him. The great ones of his family have gone down joyfully, and their hearts are happy at meeting N, you see. But he tells, well, here's one here. Welcome. This is a good one. It goes on. I've gone forth. There have been given to me my family, my children, my brethren, my father, my mother, all my dependents. The prisoners have been released to me. I used my arms releasing the prisoners in hell below, you see. And then he says, welcome. I have brought forth for you those who are your ancestors, whose names have been hidden from me. To me belongs the writing. It is I who will fashion it. So says Neat. She was the secretary. She changed places with Sechet sometimes, the secretary who keeps the record. She's been keeping the record of the ancestors. They've been lost to him, but now they're in the writing and they'll be brought forward. So these things sound familiar to us, you see. And how seriously are we supposed to take this sort of thing? It makes a very interesting picture here. But I shouldn't have interrupted. Well, anyway. We've got to keep this real. So they have this special technique. Who can put the terrible question to rest? Among the most active Egyptologists, there's a lot of them. Like I got Assmann and Dershane and Otto and Brunn and Pionkov and Kakosi and Murnane and Amtis and Frankfurt. The two most active have been Eric Hornum and Winfried Barthe. They're working their heads off now at it. Their works are devoted to a limited and clearly defined body of text, those in the tombs of the kings of the 18th to 20th dynasties, and I have the first edition of that, the only one of that, edited by Lacau in 1875. It's Neville's own. Litany of the Sun in the Tombs of the Kings of Rachel. I have it at the library. On the regular shelves. Shouldn't be there. And again, it's one of those only things, very rare. And this is the very thing that these men are working with today. Nobody has touched it since 1875. It has the tombs of four of the kings of the New Kingdom. There are two more. In fact, there are 8, but 2 principal ones. So this is a very valuable work and very useful, beautifully copied and so forth over 100 years ago. Well, here's the way we approach the subject there. Remember, Breasted's New Humanism explained the genius of Egyptian civilization as the product of organic evolution, fueled by the invincible meliorism of early 20th century America. Everything had to begin on a primitive level with small primitive societies and their primitive cults and superstitions and their primitive nature religion and what Professor Wilson used to call mumbo-jumbo that survives in Egyptian, if not all religion. And so along with that, the occult and the spooky, which is the official heritage of Africa and the jungle, has ever drawn the fakirs and the frauds to this enticing field. We mentioned that the last time. If this mystic allure still draws the kids to Saturday mornings on TV, extravaganza, cartoons, it's a favorite theme, all the crypt and Egyptian stuff. It has been, I watched them all. It has been supplanted, well, anytime you turn them on, you see something in Egypt there, usually. It has been supplanted elsewhere by something more substantial, but no less exciting. An overbalance of funerary doctrines among the records led charging the Egyptians, as Bill Murnane says, with the obsession with ritual and death, and this popular notion, despite evidence to the contrary, is not easily quelled. The nature religion has been dropped out long ago. The professional assurance that the Egyptian tomb was his house for eternity, and any cheerful reference to the after were mere euphemisms, whistling in the dark, have both been dropped. A closer look. Here's a quotation I didn't use the last time from Case. He says, the furnishing of, no, it's Franklin. The furnishings of the tomb does not prove that the Egyptian considered life after death a mere continuation of life on earth. It's not even correct to assume the materialistic implications which it inevitably suggests to us, not at all. And what about that leaving food in the tombs? Well, we know what that is. Behind a whole dinner spread in an old kingdom tomb. You see, well, obviously that's to provide a magic meal forever in the eternities. Nothing of the sort. That's not what it was for. That was just enough for the only day he would spend in the tomb. He was going to leave after that. His spirit was going to leave. His body was going to lie there and be asleep, you see. And but what about the meal? Recently, someone checked up very carefully on these hundreds of pictures of meals in the other world. You see on these steles and so forth, the person is eating a meal in the other world. What the meal they leave behind is fish and fowl, usually ducks or geese, and beef, and things like that. But in the meals given to the dead, there is no meat at all. It's all vegetarian stuff. That meal can't be eaten by the spirits because the spirits are all vegetarian. Well, that's one thing that was just discovered. Everybody's surprised. That same attribute of our own naivete to the Egyptians is seen in Breasted's straightforward nonsense. I may have mentioned this last time about the smelting of copper. Well, we'll go up to that. Well, I have to move on. Worst of all, as Case saw it, the attitude would never encourage or even allow students to ask why the Egyptians are crazy, so we leave them alone. But why did they do this? Why did they go to all this trouble? Why did they knock themselves out for thousands of years, always in the same sort of thing, going through the same routine? It just becomes routine after, but for a long time, there must be some answer to the question, why? From the first, the remarkable consistency, they were doing the same thing all the time, you see. Characteristic artistic conventions are the same. The conservative manners and customs. Well, I can start, right now. Persisting to the present day, gave notice that in Egypt we have singularly monolithic, self-contained civilization. In fact, Wilson argued that there's never any influence from the outside at all. The pyramid text, the coffin text, the Book of the Dead, in Lacau's terms, have absolutely the same object. The long literary heritage we find, Speller says, one simply continuing tradition. From prehistoric times to the end, Case says, the mythical background of things remains the same, regardless of new inventions and stories. A famous saying of Marietta, the song is badly sung or better sung as you go down, but it's always the same song they sing. And so, Neville's claim that the Book of the Dead contains debris of an archaic language, almost certainly goes back to the most ancient times, prehistoric. That's been confirmed now by Eberhard Otto, who found that none of the implements used in the funerary cult, for example, has a recognized Egyptian name. They're all prehistoric words or code names. The evolutionist approach has required that the growth Egyptian, an expression that Petrie used, something here, is the Egyptian never able to get away from the shell. The shell always clings to the chick, he says. He's never able to get away from it. It's always there. The evolutionist approach required that the growth of Egyptian civilization be from small, scattered communities, as I said before, to ever-growing amalgamations of power. Today we are told that the richness of the religious pictures, forms, and powers does not come from local tradition, but from the richness of the religious thought itself. That's what Eberhard Odo concludes. The age-old struggle between the North and the South, for example, long held to be the determining factor in Egyptian history. Everything double, the two thrones, the two graves for the king, the two colors, the red and the white. Everything is double. They said, well, that's the time when the two kingdoms fought each other. There's no evidence of their having fought each other. Or if the other one conquered the other, why were they all always on an equal footing? It's known now that the standing hostility between the two fails to show up. And it's all ritual and doctrinal in nature. It has a definite purpose. And today we are told, and there have always been two schools of thought on Egyptian studies, and this is an important one now. One school holds that the time has not yet come to risk serious interpretation of the material, and that the proper procedure for the present is to collect facts such as Ehrman's view. It can go collecting facts forever, you see. It's like this thing on global warming. Well, we don't have the facts yet. We get more facts from you won't have all the facts. Well, Ehrman would never draw any conclusions. No, we don't have the facts. Well, when will we? On the other hand, the other school, represented by Brest and Safed, they said, whatever data we have should be used to construct the best story possible at the time. They're confident that at least the general ideas are correct. We have to risk that if we're going to get anywhere. In either case, speculation was the name of the game, and the public was rigorously excluded. A generation later, Jacquier could observe, today it is vain to seek for an established theology and mythological system such as the Egyptologists of the past century invented. You can't use any of the old books at all. When there lack of documents, they used pell-mell whatever they had in hand. Well, they used that method, but it's no good anymore. But when are the documents adequate? With the exception of only a few, according to Posner, all Egyptian writings are either incomplete or very unclear. The publication of Egyptian texts has been seriously neglected. Not a single literary papyrus from the Old Kingdom has survived. And we know now how frequently and easily text could be altered. It's interesting that the great changes recently take place in the reading of the Egyptian record was not brought about, I say, by the discovery of documents, but the rereading of the old ones that had been rejected long ago. The documents have been adequate all along, but we couldn't see it, of course. If we credit the Egyptians with intelligence, more intelligence than the giants of old did, the great ones, it's not hard to discover what seems obscure to us may have been intentionally so. It's not the bloom of stupidity here. These people were smart, they were cute, they were clever, they loved to play around with words, they loved to fool each other and so forth. They were awfully sharp that way. And when you get Ehrman, and you go back to him again, who admits, and everybody else admits, he was very stupid in school, never learned French or German, never learned, not even French and German, he spoke French very well, he was a French family, Huguenot family. But he says he never learned Greek or Latin, and he never learned Arabic because they were just too hard, he couldn't do it. And he's the one to take the Egyptians to task for being obscure in their writing, and they try to pun and fool each other all over the place. One must still recognize in the text intentional obscurities, as T.J. Allen says, a fondness for multiple meanings, as Case said, ascribable pleasure in sportive readings, as Yoyota said. We are now reminded that a religious symbol is not an aid to weak heads, but only the only possible way of making the incomprehensible comprehensible, says Rudolf Anthus. Much Egyptian cryptography may well be meant not to confound the reader, but to challenge him to use his brains for fun and profit. They've deliberately made it that way, and to invite you to try to read it. That was Riotom's interpretation. He spent more time by far with cryptograms than anyone else. He says, yes, the Egyptians did this on purpose because it's like a crossword puzzle. They wanted you to use your brains, and you knew you couldn't pass it by. It was a temptation. It's becoming ever more apparent that the Egyptian graphic art is a form of script, a sort of memento, yielding their secrets of doctrine and remaining mute for those who are not party pris. But what have been taken as random and disconnected vagaries actually come all together, as it were, in a single all-embracing text. As Posner calls it, like an immense hymn from beginning to end. They do have something to tell us. They're saying, calls Egyptian a meta-language. Runs along sideways. You have to be a specialist and an Egyptian to know. Egyptology has not yet worked out a way to write Egyptian without hieroglyphics. Now, that's a very recent study by Schenkel. The only way you can write it is by writing hieroglyphics. The best way it could possibly be written, not the most painful. Trying to computerize has revealed our ignorance in that regard. There's another recent article that says we cannot relay computerized information about Egyptian texts unless they are fed reliable grammatical and semantic information. The hardest questions being, can Egyptian concepts be mechanically recognized? We can't do it yet. Well, that's what both Ammon and Gardner spent all their days trying to do, trying to give mechanical, unbreakable, fixed, reliable rules to Egyptian grammar. And they never came up with anything anywhere near it. We have not yet taken into account the vast resources of hieroglyphic system for expressing complex ideas, wrote J. Yoyota, the last thing he wrote. Commenting on a translation of text of Tutankhamun, Anthis writes, I may frankly say, I wonder what a reader not very well acquainted with Egyptian religion may possibly get out of a study of these texts and pictures. He may find ideas that appeal to him, but he will hardly know what the Egyptians actually thought. But who is very well acquainted with Egyptian religions? No scholar can claim such a mastery unless he's able to explain clearly and simply in his own words what would be perfectly comprehensible to an ordinary reader. If you can't explain it, you don't know it yourself. And so, if the one is left out in the cold, so is the other, the Egyptologist. If the layman is left out in the cold because nobody can tell him what this really means, who is the Egyptologist who says he knows if he can't tell him what it really means? He doesn't know. To this day, which animal hieroglyphs were literal and which were symbolic, we're still quoting it, is not to be determined with certainty. Every scholar must interpret for himself. Well, that's a fine condition of things. One talks glibly of fetiches, sun gods, falcon gods, and so forth, wrote Frankfurt of the old school, as if precision of those terms had any reference to the gods themselves. Sometimes the symbols tell us something about a god, sometimes it does not. The use of classificatory terms is connected with gods, bars the road to understanding. Now, this is very common. In criticizing Joseph Smith, for example, they say, well, this is just half of that's all it is, or this is just Osiris. The vaguest idea of who Hathor Osiris was. We've been told by the Greeks we wouldn't have any explanation of the rites if we didn't have some Greek writings on the subject. Who these were supposed to be, but of course the names goes with them. But such classifications as Osiris, well, he's the god of the dead, of course, and Re, he's the sun god, they pass as sufficient explanations, and they don't explain a thing. What is emerging today is a view of the old religious materials from this new angle. The trouble is, we have all along on our hands, quoting J. Assman, who's done lots of work now. He's the one. Well, this is 1983 he's writing. A jumbled but recognizable and consistent cycle. Notice they're jumbled, but we still recognize all of them, but what do we make of them? And consistent cycle of liturgical, cosmographical, and cultic elements. We have unlimited varieties of mythical situations. We have rites and ordinances having the aspects of a variegated mosaic, rather arbitrarily put together. That's the problem, that's what they're saying. Is we recognize the separate pieces, but they're arbitrarily put together. How do we make a picture out of that? We find unexpected changes of function as one god takes over the insignia of another. The fact that Egyptian religion is full of contradictions, we're quoting Jacquier now, the fact that Egyptian religion is full of contradictions, so shocking at first sight, just shows us that we've not yet found the truth, and can only gradually penetrate the mystery of Egyptian religions. Meantime, immune to public examination, the Egyptologists still engage in what Anthis called an altogether too free and easy luftige, too free and easy game, playing around with wrongly understood concepts confirmed by 5 or 6 passages of text. Is it any wonder that students feel, as they always have, what Dershain calls a certain malaise, a feeling of strangeness and alienation, which our education cannot overcome. But for established scholars, this jumble has ever been a happy hunting ground. It's just what they want. It offers endless opportunities for speculation and lively debate. Which gods or cults originated where, which absorbed which influenced which, or to what degree, and so forth and so on. The variations and the permutations are endless, and each one is worth an article. What are the chances of getting all this sorted out? It's the overwhelming predominance of certain themes which suggest a uniform plot, a fundamental doctrine that runs through the whole thing, a single epic telling a story which for all its digressions and involutions is coming together now. Boy. Now, we have been privileged to see only recently, says Duchesne, who is writing very well on this note, a veritable renewal of religious studies. A number of Egyptologists, especially in Germany, give the subject a complete rethinking, as Horning wrote, very recently, 1989, completely rethinking the whole thing now. Most studies these days are subjects which were hardly mentioned by Seta in his school. There's another quotation by Bianco, who systematically ignored the intrinsic value of religious composition, which was consequently temporarily lost, and it's only been found just in the last few years. For the early Egyptologists, Bianco explains, this religion was highly mysterious and mystical, still under the influence of Kabbalistic speculations of the 17th century. Then came a sudden reaction. Scholars lost all interest in religion. Egyptology became Hamlet with Hamlet left out. So, because without religion, what do the Egyptians got? You see, that was what they'd tell you. We are now at the beginning of a new era. It's like the BYU without religion. We are now at the beginning. Well, it's just as important. It was their whole life. We are now at the beginning of a new era, says he, pulling out all the stops. To back him up, we may note that since World War II, quoting R.E. Murphy, a very recent article, there has been an avalanche of commentaries on the wisdom books of the Egyptians, particularly in their relationship to Hebrew wisdom literature, which nobody would go near, as we saw the last time, scrupulously avoided by Ehrman and company, in which great strides have been made in the last 2 decades, in other words. The last 2 decades, great strides. But this is very interesting. You see, we're bringing Hebrew into the subject, which, of course, is a definite plus for Joseph Smith, and we're going to prepare the ground for something. If not more humble, Egyptologists seem to have become more tolerant. Thus, the classical writers whose testimony was impatiently dismissed by the great ones as being good, talking about the Greeks, Diodorus, Herodotus, and so forth, more reliable accounts, the more we read it, the more reliable they appear, though we rejected them entirely before. Ancient moderns who laughed at the Egyptians are displaying ignorance of the uninitiated. In the new thinking, magic, which always supplied the most convenient explanation of Egyptian thought and action, has been dropped out, you see. Magic and religion, they always clash together, you see, the positivists. But they're opposites, actually. Look at the Liahona and Urim and Thummim. They work only by faith. A magic thing is gadget. See, the magic ring, the magic book, the magic staff, the magic robe. If you can get that, then you have the power. If you can get Solomon's ring, you have Solomon's power. Solomon's throne, you have Solomon's power. There's a great cycle of legends about that sort of thing. Because the magic is in the thing. It's automatic. But the Liahona isn't magic. Urim and Thummim is magic. They work by faith, intense concentration, only under special conditions. They're tested. The opposite thing from magic. See, a magic, we say a thing works by magic. Nobody knows how to do it. It just works automatically, and that's that, like the magic drugs and medicines and so on. But as long as we don't know, we say it's magic. But with these other things, it works by faith. Religion is the opposite. The Egyptian is always, now this is a very interesting quotation from Bono here. The Egyptian is always sober. Wine he regards as the disruption of the order in the world. He does not transcendentalize, fall into ecstasies, induce trances, resort to drugs. Gardner noted the hard-headed realism of the Egyptian. And Horn even maintains that there is, quote, not one slightest trace of mysticism in their thinking. The fact that the spurned and neglected Book of the Dead now emerges as a compendium of knowledge, of science of the beyond. Incidentally, the one thing that saved the Book of the Dead and produced more and more editions of Budge's translation was Budge's translation, you see, which instead of representing an advance in knowledge of text actually was a regression, as Horning writes, not merely worthless but pernicious. And of Mercer's 4 volumes, our friend Mercer here, he had the attack against Joseph Smith. The last work he did was a 4-volume translation of the pyramid text, which we're told it does not represent the present knowledge of the language, which it certainly doesn't. Well, it was not modern religion, but rather a cosmology, what the religion had. A true physical science, which embraced a unified field. In short, I better start down here. Only recently, quoting again, only recently it has become apparent that the Egyptian religion is a physical science, a physique, which strangely suggests the ideas of Heraclitus of Ephesus. It was not modern religion, but rather cosmology, a true physical science which embraced a unified field. In short, he says, pas mystique meum physique. What a turnabout. Men and gods not only share the same universe of discourse, but dwell together in the same physical universe. The great ones of old could not accept the antics of the Egyptians and other lower creatures, as they viewed them from the lofty eminence of modern scientific observer examining the observed. What they gagged at, but in all this, the one thing the Egyptologists have now gagged at was this, taking them seriously. They just couldn't do it. Or listening to the crackpots who did take them seriously. That's why the Mormons made them nervous. As long as they kept to their childish world of magic and make-believe, the ancients could be tolerated. But the idea that they might be right about something, that was something else. Herman says it made him physically ill. Now, the idea emerges that the Egyptian teachings are to be taken in the most literal sense. Indeed, it was only in the late period that their doctrines finally became spiritualized, and then, says they're saying, their whole religion became hollow and empty, devoid of meaning and content as soon as it stopped being literal and became spiritual. The Santayana says the difference between their scientific outlook and ours is not in the accumulation of facts, but in the deteriorating expectorations. I love that. Deteriorating. I wish mine wouldn't. I've got this summer allergy about that. But the deteriorated expectations of our ruling our time. They expected more than we do. That's to say, the Egyptians, we discount the possibility of other worlds, that is, of anything that we don't know already. If we don't know it already, we say it doesn't exist until we do know it, you see. But the Egyptians made a better use of facts. Yeah, that means he had a broader view of reality than we do. When he said everything, he used utet netet. That means everything which I am aware of, as well as everything which I may not be aware of. And in the same way, Gardner says, when he says jeter neh, that expression meaning, according to Gardner, granted life like ray, it is the eternity, everything in eternity that ever has existed in the past or ever will exist in the future. When you refer to time, you say you must refer at the same time to all the past and all the future, because they extend in both directions. In both directions, there's no place where you can draw a line. There's no place where you can mark the present, which keeps escaping you all the time. Nehajet, he said, granted life like ray, from eternity in the past to eternity in the future. And in the same way, utet netet, that which is not, see? That which is far more important than that which is, because I only know a very tiny little bit of that which is. But that which is not, that's the reality out there, which I miss entirely, which we're trying to move into. That's the big stuff. And so, this is better and truer than my arrogant positivistic assertion. When I do not see something, I say with Queen, I'm going to say Guinevere, but she's not that. Nothing at all, yet all that is I see. He asks her if you see something. She says, I see nothing at all, yet all that is I see. If you don't see it, it just doesn't exist. In modern times, religion, quoting somebody else, when not a ground for ethical and political action, seems to be reduced to a personal relationship between man and God, between God and man. In Egypt, religion was just as much a system of communication capable of extension to embrace everything existing and alive. Well, what would it take to get a sophisticated modern person to consider Egyptian religion seriously, especially if he seems to be claiming a sound, literal, factual knowledge of things? One might be willing to make concession to sort of science fiction, and science fiction has always had a especially soft place for Egypt. As a borderline case, you can see why the appeal of both science fiction and Egyptian lore is the tantalizing sense of plausibility. This might just be so. There's just enough scientific explanation, a reasonable explanation, to me, it might be plausible. That makes it more fascinating. It's not just mere fantasy fiction. It's science fiction, 99% fiction, but if it's 1% science, that puts another element. And this makes the appeal of the Egyptian. The problem is that of notation, just like our algebra. Anything can be substituted for anything in any operation, and they do it, as long as you understand what you're doing. See, that's why we don't follow them. We've always assumed that the Egyptians, living long ago, and therefore quite childish, drew the pictures as literally as we do, even though they exhibit all over the place their capacity for letting almost any symbol stand for almost any other symbol in almost any operation. Thus, Re, Osiris, Horus, Shepri, Atum are all, quote, merely representations of this mysterious, secret, and complex concept of deity, as Barta says. You can use any one of them you want in a particular operation to represent that particular activity of God. Using new methods for evaluating apparently insignificant details, wrote Duchesne in 1983, we find unexpected exchange of functions among these figures, one taking over the insignia of another whenever convenient. Hence, we cannot decide with certainty, for example, what the schematic ancient representations turning up over and over again actually mean. And this is another thing, this argument of familiarity. You see, the answer to Joseph would say, oh, this is very familiar. I've seen thousands of those. You'll see those who have been, who were to challenge Joseph's misinterpretations. They said, well, you can find this in any museum. These are common things, hundreds of these. Well, what does that mean, you see? To be familiar with a thing doesn't mean that you understand it. As Dr. Johnson says, if that was the case, the old woman who sells eggs in the marketplace would be the great authority on embryology. For 50 years, she's been selling eggs. She should know about embryology. She doesn't follow at all. And these people say, oh, yes, I'm perfectly familiar. I've seen that figure 1,000 times. Well, you have. What does it mean? He doesn't know. And so it is that way. This problem is of great importance. Well, anyway, after rush alone, this is awful. What I once failed to understand was the Egyptian symbols are just that. They are pure abstractions, but nonetheless they represent real things, real realities. The universe out there is real, but these doodles neither depict nor describe it, but they refer to it. They are no more magic than the signs used in math and physics and chemistry all the time to represent things and processes. Sometimes they can neither be described nor described, yet they are there, and there's nothing hocus-pocus or childish attempt to show us pictures, anything like that. Though it could be argued in the sense that they are both. There's something magical about it. The books on mathematics, like people like Morris Klein and so forth, can't explain why this should be so. It's quite magical. And all the figures you use, well, so often in chemistry and physics, were really little drawings that started out as pictures, but they're now just abstractions. That's exactly how the Egyptians used it. They weren't stuck with these things as pictures at all. We are not told that the gods of Egypt are the mythical expression, we are now told, not told, that the mythical expression of diffuse forces of the universe, and that the legends depict the relations of these forces, which are only accessible through carrying out of certain operations or ordinances, as you solve a problem in math. So we see now, we're quoting from this is Jan Bergman writing, a very good person writing right now. So we see how divine epithets are freely passed around among the gods who fused with each other just as easy as they fused with their earthly representatives. Like characters in a Shakespeare play, they may represent human vices or virtues or nations or all of humanity, or represent themselves or gods or forces of nature or all of the above. But you must state your problem first, and this is what happens. You see, Egyptian state his problem first, and this problem is constantly being stated. The Book of the Dead is a good example of that. In a particular operation, an Egyptian teacher asks us, he says this, let Ba represent a spirit of such and such as a person. And the word is conveniently represented. Why do you use a ram? Because Aram, the name of Ram, is Ba, and Ba is the word for spirit, and Ba is also the noise that a ram makes to assert its presence in the field and so forth. So it's a convenient one to use. But they didn't believe for a moment that the spirit was a ram or anything like that. A common practice, when a statement or image is placed before us, is for the scribe or the priest to ask what you make of it. What do you make of this, and what should we say it means? This is asked all the time. They do this. Through the Book of the Dead, it's constantly being asked. He asks, what is this? And then the answers are supplied. It is such and such. It added, then you add, but others say, well, we have it right here, but others say, it is such and such. And as our teacher, he doesn't tell us what the answer is, right or wrong. He doesn't say, there's this answer. He'll give sometimes as much as a dozen answers, and he doesn't tell us which is the right one. You can use the one you want if you understand what conditions have been given. Thus, a well-known passage from the famous 17th chapter of the Book of the Dead. We are faced with the puzzling situation of a cat splitting the sacred issue tree. We should have a slide of this, shouldn't we? We don't. It has no visible reference to anything else before or after. Why a cat? Why an issue tree? Why splitting it, for example? Well, the word cat here used is written out as miu, and miao is the word for cat in Egyptian. You wonder why? Miao is the word for cat, actually, is one word, of course. But miu also means, as may be, as such and such a person, so and so. So that it means that somebody is splitting the tree, somebody or other. And it notes whoever did it. But whoever did it was a very smart person. And the smartest of them all is Sia, idea personifying perception or intelligence. So the cat in question may be Sia. So one of the answers is this probably refers to Sia, intelligence. That is, if you want it to work it that way. But you don't have to. As long as you use the symbols as consistent with a given problem, you can pretty well choose the symbols you want. As to the strange act of splitting the tree, why splitting the tree? Some say it is Shesemu who brawled with Osiris and they split. Or some say it is it was the influence of the wine that brought the quarrel about. Others say it is a certain Apepi who has one head with two truths. The false tongue, the double-tongued serpent, you see, it means that's splitting. Others say it is Horus with two heads, one of justice and the other of injustice. I have a slide of that, but it's in my pocket. As might be, it wouldn't do you any good. Well, it's interesting, of course, but I'm afraid it would delay things. As might be expected, the sounds of the words were as freely exploited as in making these associations as the physical images. The Egyptians were very fond of puns. Others, it goes on, say it is Horus in Min's domain, other Geb on earth, others Nefertum, the lion with a lotus, others the sons of Bast, the cat. It's interesting that the name for Bast, the cat goddess, is never written with a cat. It's written with a basket. You can play around with these things this way. Others, that is the council which repelled the enemies of the Most High God, the council, there was a division in the council. So all this thing, a cat splitting a tree. All of these solutions speculate on the one idea of splitting, and none of them is condemned. Another famous passage from the Litany of the Sun tells us, 3 are all the gods, Amun, Re, and Ta. Incidentally, it's Yimun, Rao, and Ta now. Rao is the way the Germans are reading the name for Re. We've always called it Re, then we called it Ra, like the ship Ra. Now it's being read Rao. A very growling sort of sound. But anyway, Amun, Re, and Ta, concealing his name as Amun, his face is Re, his body is Ta. Now each of these, Amun, Re, and Ta, each had a face, and he had a name, and he had a body too. But for this operation, it explains, each receives this value we choose to give it. The whole awareness of Egyptians is with the miraculous reality of life. And why not? It's there for everybody to see. It seems perfectly natural, one wonders, until one compares it with the present world's fascination with extermination. A deep sense of responsibility toward nature forbade him to destroy life and to reverence it, and admonish him to reverence it in every form. Pharaoh's high calling made him responsible for all within his dominion. And as Sigrid Schacht said, he never dealt wantonly or wastefully with anything. It is significant that Western historians were never able to conceive of the building of the pyramids as anything but an orgy of brutality and insane self-aggrandizement. And from the beginning, one of the earliest discoveries was the magnificent tomb of El Berche, which shows us how they really made these things, fully illustrated, telling how such great works were undertaken in a spirit of dedication, high purpose, happy equality, good-humored competition, real brotherhood, holy dedication. It was done without all that suffering or anything else. And that was a monster thing they were shown doing there. An inscription from Abydos shows Ramses IV's great reverence for all life, his concern not to harm any living creature. It was his power to think, which the Egyptian believed gave him his dominion over nature, which accordingly had to be a thoughtful dominion. As they're saying, Gödel writes about that too. The dominion of Seth, or Satan, on the other hand, no one has ever explained his picture. And he's represented by a picture. Nobody explains it. He has the head of an aardvark or something like that, and he has the tail of an arrow, a straight arrow. Nobody knows to this day, and it occurs thousands of times. So that's Seth. He represents Satan, the evil one. His rule is brutal and mindless. His most distinguishing characteristic was his total inability to beget, to create, or produce anything. His object was to rule, and his method was to compel, threaten, and destroy. See, he was turned down in the council of heaven, though he was the elder son, and he went out and named it. He wants to dominate what he cannot create or understand. His actions are all just reactions. He cannot destroy until someone else has built. He aspires to possess what others have created. He accuses after others have acted. He is diabolos, literally meaning the accuser of his brother. He contends after others have spoken, and he would bar others from the way on which he cannot go. Such minor epics as the victory over Seth and the El Arish fragment, the Islamic beautiful shrine discovered on the border between Egypt and Palestine, they vividly describe him and his activities there. That's the sort of person he was. If the Egyptians stubbornly persisted in trying to solve the question of getting the most out of life, that is, of infinitely prolonging it after making it worth prolonging, the first test would naturally be, as Goethe says, a proper reference for the life that was already around it. For us to seize upon Genesis 1:28 as a franchise, I'm preaching now, to subdue the earth by exterminating what is on it, there should be a lesson from a civilization which has lasted 50 centuries for one which is threatened with extinction after less than 10 generations. If we are to go on living, we must deserve it. The Egyptians felt that. If we are sincere in our desire for a higher life, we seek, as Teilhard says, all living things do, to live just the way they should live already. And the Egyptian was exercised to make this world, now we can have some pictures, I suppose, to make this world as much like the other one, the real world, the true world, the lasting, the perfect one as possible. As if to show himself ready to deserve it, even after ages of waste and destruction, the ruins he left us seem strangely oversized, majestic, sublime, splendor, rather simple, and yet, for all that, but richly adorned, but not too richly adorned. There's no oriental profusion in them much. The vast dimensions strangely graceful and natural repose, but after all, when you consider the Parthenon, St. Peter's, Angkor Wat, they all have those qualities. They're transcendental. They're unworldly places. They represent the best we can do, the nearest approach we can get to the other world, and they were sacred grounds. They were a place where the two worlds meet. They were temples in other worlds. They're supposed to transport us, give us a glimpse of that other world. The point about Egypt is that the whole country was that way. From one end to the other, 500 miles, you found that sort of magnificence. Is anything up there? We have slides showing the usual pictures. We've left out the pyramids, which are very unorthodox. But we'll see if they can put something on like that. Just rattle off what we've got there. Now you see this. You're familiar with all these, but what we notice is give us the next one. That's the hypocephalus in the condition in which it was last seen. This is a good one. That's another one. We won't refer to that one now. Give us the next one. I thought we'd talk about it. Now, this is the sort of thing, we all know what it's about. But the whole length of now, this is the sort of thing, this grandeur. Must they do it? Why must they do this sort of thing? Give us some more. Next. See, there's no way of connecting here. That's upside down, but you see, they take advantage of the natural surroundings and exploit them. They carry on the magnificence of the cliffs right down below and so on. Give us the next one, hoping it's the right side up. There's the temple at Luxor. This outsized things, do they have to be so large? And the next. We know these are the famous Memnon the singing Memnons, the two statues there, and they're just north of on the other, across there, they're in Thebes, across the river Luxor. And the next. And you'll see these columns, 65 feet high, and they hold 85 men can stand on the top of one. They tell us so they shouldn't try it. But that's what was in my high school textbook, which was by Breasted, needless to say. Mrs. Breasted said that was the best-selling textbook ever sold in high school. It sold enormously, and Breasted never got a penny out of it, Miller's. That's the way they do things. Mrs. Breasted told me that when we were riding our bicycles together. And then go on, and we have something. Let's have some more, would you? Now here's the other side of it, you see. What other people represent men and gods alike, not as figures of power and dominance, though surrounded by symbols of power. They themselves are always delightful people, slim, pleasant, uncomplicated, feeling no discomfort and looking all very much alike, non-competitive, No attempt at human grandeur. This is the typical family portrait you see from this in the lower world, and as they get up higher, you see down below it's Horus, and up here, and it's Osiris on top. But there's the father and the mother and the children. These are typical, and they're sort of standardized drawings. You see, there are others. Well, could you give us another one? We'll see. I think the Shackleton is the next one. No, he isn't. This is something else. We'll see that now. What I'm bringing right now. The most recent study on ancient has just come out, just this month, from Yale University Press. It tells us what we've known all along, that it was not the Greeks who gave us our Western models. This is a terrible picture. This is hell. We don't want to look at that. We should look at the other one. No, we show you pictures of heaven on one side and pictures of hell on this is another one. Picture of hell. You see figures walking upside down and all this sort of thing. Well, this is what goes with that. The Greeks gave us our Western models of true and beautiful. The kalos kagathos of the Greeks. It wasn't the Greeks, it was the Egyptians, and we've known that a long time, actually. Palya, the author of the book, locates the birth of Western visual culture not in Greece, but in Egypt. The Egyptians invented elegance, he says. Elegance is reduction, simplification, condensation. Egyptian high culture has been underestimated. This elegance, relaxed yet disciplined, as against Oriental excess, is more than the New Kingdom sophistication. You may go through the vast volumes of Resensky's big atlas on the ancient Egyptian culture history, volume 3 especially. There you'll find hundreds and hundreds of figures from the Old Kingdom, just the same graceful types. It never changes. They're standardized. You say, well, isn't that just an antique, people all alike? No, if ever there were individuals, it was these Egyptians. They were able to preserve it. Well, but they are unaffected, appealing simplicity and charm by a constant awareness of affinity with all of nature. These unmistakable qualities were all duly first noted by the first modernists way back in the 1840s. They noted them, but in a recent effort by Kaiser, quite recent, another recent, I'll give you nothing but the latest, don't you understand? But his evolutionary bias later revoked the award and gave it all to the Greeks. We didn't want the Egyptians to have it, but they deserved it. They were the great civilization. And still going. The tomb inscriptions seem to promise two different homes. Well, I'm going to skip this 2 now. And that. Well, there's a paradox here. Now we've got to show you the hell pictures from the tombs of the tombs of the kings of the kingdom. The Egyptians had no illusion about this world. He knows the weakness of our faith and the best promise we can give people with the limited vision of life offers. A strong vein of skepticism and satire about this life runs through the literature from the Old Kingdom right to the present. In fact, Emma Brunner-Traut has just maintained that the whole literature is satire. Everything they write is satire. That's not so. Well, this is a paradox. Pedosiris, for example, gives us a good description of hell. Those pictures of the underworld are no infantile. See, they're walking upside down and so forth. Pictures in various angles, people in badly damaged. Give us some more hell, would you? There's another one. But down at the bottom, you notice the headless figures, the beheaded figures here, the punishment, people that are bound in various degrees. But these pictures of the underworld are an accurate description of our present life here below. That's why they're cynical. The life here is that way, they say. This dim, skewed, upside-down world with figures usually drawn backwards, as a recent description of them, with its endless proceedings of zombie-like figures. This is no childish invention of a bogeyman genre. It is just such a world as we inhabit. It's exaggerated indeed, but that's because we haven't yet got quite that far yet. But that's the way we are going, and we're practically there now. Now give us another one, would you? Another one is. Would you give us the next one? Next one. Oh, this is another one. Oh, wait. That one is good. Well, no, see the figures in various odd places. I see the procession down here at the left, walking upside down and so forth. Others buried in uncomfortable positions and the like. Some up, some down, surrounded by the serpents and the like. They say that's the way we're going. There's nothing really clear to us here. These look-alike, mindless creatures walking lockstep through the underworld admonish us that what we are doing to ourselves. If we were to portray our world as it really is, to the eye of the spiritual beholder, as Joseph Smith puts it, is not very much the way it would appear. This is a more accurate picture of our world. I'll give us another one. I'll show you a picture by Heiner, who was, this is one. Notice the figures in various conditions. Their heads chopped off, the blood coming out, and people upside down, people sitting down in various forms of discomfort, the line of beheaded and bound figures down at the bottom and so forth. This is the way reality is, actually. I'll show you a picture. The first, I think the next one is the first engraving ever to show, yes, war in a battle in a non-heroic way. I think it was by Heiner in the 16th century. You see, these are monsters. This is a hellish picture. This is a picture of a battle. But this is more accurate than any picture or photograph I've ever seen of a battle. It is hell. It's that sort of way. It's monsters who are fighting, the things these people are doing to each other. They shouldn't be. Notice the cannon here is a devil's machine. Everything is fiendish. Nothing but fiends are fighting. Some are gloating and some you can't see it very well and so forth. But this is the usual Netherlands fantasy school. They made the monsters, you see. But this is the world. This is a more accurate picture, you see, that we have of our world than any heroic picture of a battle you've seen. Well, life in the eternal mode must be very different from this one. Now, this is an Egyptian idiom, axiom, writes J.L. Casimir. In an attempt to put mankind into contact with the world of the Gans Army, the totally different, Horner uses the same expression for the underworld, which he describes as a remnant of the world before the creation. To reach other worlds, we must make a journey in time as well as space. If we have an eternal existence, as the Egyptians figured, it must be something very different from what's going on here, but it must be in the real cosmos at the same time. So what are we going to do it? And it must be so different from the way we are living now that to attempt to enter it without proper preparation would be fatal. It would be like the equivalent of bringing matter and antimatter together. We destroy ourselves if we had to go to the presence of God now. Of course, this is gospel too. In the inscriptions, we're constantly reminded both of the vast distance and the appalling danger that separates us here, such as transition entails. Horning begins his book on the subject with this sentence: a broad stream lies between this world and the next world. This is the great yawning gulf between us and eternal life, and our object is to reach eternal life. This is the basic situation we have to face. Or as Barta puts it, the purpose of the rites and ordinances that the king and commoner must perform is to negotiate the passage from this side to that side, in Ibadong from these sites and Yen sites, in order to secure one's status for the eternities, which since the eternal is eternal, it's necessary to be divine, and that's equivalent to the status of divinity. How do you get yourself from this very faulty world? Look at today's paper, you'll see that. To get to an eternal existence, because what is eternal and imperishable must be divine. What a gap, what a distance, and they were horrified by that distance. How can we negotiate? What can we do? Remembering that we have to keep this on a scientific, proper, rational basis. Could it be explained? The unknown inspires fear. The step across the threshold of death is the dangerous one, moving into enormous spaces and horrendous dangers. That's Horner again. We know nothing about what is there, but there is a super heaven. The sky we see is not that heaven, and the sun we see is not the sun god at all. It's just one of his forms, one of the representations, one of his works. And so, his life, like our life, his spirit, like that of Ray, is in heaven, and our body, our jet, is on earth after that. How do you get them together? It's far from heaven and the underworld. No gods know his true shape. His true glory cannot be revealed. Instant death, you cannot see his glory and remain alive, as Moses says. So, the unknown is frightening. Our all-embracing ignorance, the great unknown, is as real as anything we call real. The one thing we call real is this vast ignorance we have. But we can retain our sanity by acknowledging the anthropic principle, which the scientists are talking about a lot now. The moving of XYZ. The Egyptian was convinced that if he was must be an active participant in whatever he had observed. That's the anthropic principle, you get that in the processes of the cosmos, and that if he stopped thinking, something serious would happen. He shouldn't dare. He should keep his mind on it. It would preserve his sanity. It would also preserve the universe as far as that goes. It would make a difference. The two are mutually independent. He felt that. This is called the anthropic principle. They talk about this today. And staggering as the operation is, we're involved in it, whether we like it or not. In the 19th century BC, the kings of Egypt began to emphasize the positive aspects of the tomb and the underworld as the place prepared not for eternal rest, but for regeneration and resurrection from the dead. He was interested in the underworld in its positive aspects, the regeneration of the dead being possible only there, to which the spirit would return later on to reclaim the body after it had gone down to regenerate itself. Not to remain there permanently, but to remain, emerge again from the depths. I'm reading from some new stuff here. The main theme of all these books, Piankov finds, is that life and death are a continuous process, that life engenders death and death life. Mummification is preparation not for eternal sleep, but to keep the body on hold until the spirit is ready to come back and enter it again. Just because of our vast fund of ignorance, the whole thing must be terrifying experience. Why not? For faulted creatures aspiring to immortality, by definition, can be nothing less than divinity. There is much to give pause. No matter how sure we are that the whole thing is real, one must be prepared. The meaning of the Book of the Dead for the individual is now explained this way. I enter in ignorance, I depart in enlightenment. It's to be initiated. They've always avoided that word initiation, but they're introducing it now a great deal. The tomb inscriptions regularly inform us that the owners have lived a righteous life. They always tell us that they have fulfilled the requirements to qualify as a yemek, as venerated state, and especially as an ach, a glorified celestial being. Above all, they're being enlightened. The word the Germans are using, almost working it to death today, is verklärung. Verklärung, enlightenment, exaltation, knowledge too. In the word much favored by them. To be enlightened is, before everything, to have knowledge. Of Ray himself it is said, knowledge is his heart, taste is in his lips. He leadeth mankind in every way. One can participate and benefit in these things only to the degree in which one has knowledge. But how do you acquire knowledge of what is hopelessly above us? How can, they say, that can come only, quoting by by Anthus, that can come only by revelation. We can't pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. The Egyptian mysteries of godliness are nothing less than revelation, he tells us. And the important part of that knowledge we need is what is called the Abrams technique, the things we must do, the ordinances we must carry out, which he calls the most grandiose and intelligent attempt to overcome death. Now, to overcome death is not the object at all. To overcome it once, not once, he says, but many times is maybe necessary. It's the same means of endlessly regenerating existence. Though the idea of initiation has been avoided, as I say that, I say if it looks like an elephant, call it an elephant. Yes, as Professor Popper used to say, call it an elephant. Egyptian initiation is simply passing over the threshold of death, the essence of all the later mystery cults. Another quote. The essence of initiation, it's acquiring knowledge, understanding, comprehension. In Egypt, you go through, you would hear the answers and explanations, and then you'd be required to give them back at the proper place in testing. From the pyramid text on, to become an enlightened or a glorified one was the object of the funeral ordinances, which were essentially a course of instruction, as Barta says. Only through knowledge does one become an ach, sanctified, exalted, initiated, enlightened. No wonder Hornung insisted. No attempt should be made to translate the word. And universal knowledge begins with the story of the creation of the world out of chaos. The knowledge is contained in the books, which are in the house of life, the temple, they being nothing less than the emanations of Re, direct revelations from heaven. In a great book of the Amduat, the instruction is given in dramatic form, and Barta notes that it is not a funeral text. All this preparation is what we call an endowment. The tomb of the prince Paheri is a very good example. Not that long, I had a Xerox of the whole document. It's very interesting. He's the prince of the Middle Kingdom. What you go through in the program there, he says, in the temple. The process begins this way. Well, this all gone through at the funeral again, on a different level, of course. You become a mummy then. Then you're laid away in the tomb with this. Then one becomes a ba. Your spirit is free to go and come. And then you receive the necessary offerings to see you off to the next world. To get there, you have to become, well, we'll say a bird, a Bennu bird, a minute swallow, a big hawk, a Senatian auk, all of which are able to fly free. Use any one of those to represent your ability to get around, to get between this world and the other world. One must cross the great and awful gulf, the waters of noon, for which a voyager, you would take a ship in most cases, which can sail the waters above or the waters beneath. He has now broken the earth's hold and begins a new life cycle. He completes the opening of the mouth, the initiatory cycle. That each member of the body is put on hold against the day of the resurrection, for a completely satisfying hereafter cannot dispense with some physical components. That's another quotation. With all working parts in order, even allowing play for appetites, desires, and passions, they will rise with us. Paheri is restored, it says, to his proper and perfect form. Quite literally, it says, Mwen Ma'a. In the true sense of the word, he's really restored to his proper and perfect form. He is now free to go wherever he pleases, and the grave has no victory, so death has no sting. He will no more see corruption, which means that he is divine with the Akhus and immortal, mingling with the blessed spirits, embracing his loved ones as on earth. This last is the theme of a vivid and moving passage from the coffin text, meeting with one's family hereafter, the one I was reading some of those, meeting your family in the hereafter. Such blessings as they must be earned, and Paheri tells us of his righteous life, how he walked upon the way of life, it is called. He says, come to me, I will teach you the way of life. He was a high priest. He was honest and upright in all things, he says. My own heart led me, always busy, promoted to high authority and command, a holy man and wise, never engaging in gossip or intrigue, saying nothing that was harmful to anybody and not encouraging and helpful, bearing a perfectly clear conscience, holding high office, never contending or making trouble or boasting, a man free of vanity, having never given offense to a fellow creature. They really rub it in. He is prepared for salvation, to be possessed of all things. In the solar litany, there's a long list of attributes which the righteous in the next world share with Re himself. His name, his nature, his glory, his perfections, his joy, his power, his throne. Finally, Paheri appeals to whoever reads this to believe on what he says. I am preaching the gospel to you, he says. And this written text testifies to the reality of God and his blessings, because he gives his life history along with that. Well, this is, you see, you recognize familiar notes all the way here. The world has been wont to see the great exertions of, well, I'm nearly through now, but this all, believe it or not, this all connects up with the hypocephalon very intimately. The world has been wont to see in the great exertions of the Egyptians one long, doomed, and futile struggle to overcome death, a theme on which Edward Meyer waxes quite eloquently. Never before in the history of the world was a struggle to do this hopeless thing, this heartbreaking task that all, they never gave it up. This poor fools still kept at it, overcoming it. That wasn't the problem at all. They tell us that now. That idea is rejected today. Death is as essential as birth to keeping the life cycle going. Certainly, it would have been clear all along that no people were more aware of the inevitability of death. They couldn't miss that point, and often speak of it. The best descriptions of morbid, the best Gothic descriptions of death you find in Egyptian tomb writings. Professor Lesko suggests they tried to postpone death. That would hardly be the purpose of rites to celebrate it for people who are already dead, and try to postpone the right of a person celebrating his funeral, the death of his funeral. Well, anyway, death was an essential part of eternity as birth. It alone could check and reverse the aging process. The tomb is the proper place for resurrection, because there the body is, and there the spirit must come to get it. There alone the spirit and body can unite again, and only in that place. But just how is such a meeting to be arranged? I'll show you how we'll cut it down. The prime source of knowledge of all things was in Egypt ever the temple, the house of life, holding the resources to describe the universe and its phenomena. The temple was a sort of powerhouse, when Egyptology describes it, where energy from on high can be directed where it will serve and be most effective on earth as it is in heaven. The ordinances carried out there put the individual into the picture, the big picture. At Heliopolis, the greatest and most venerable of all the centers, which was held to go back to the pre-existence, the object of the books and studies was a hologram, a listing of inventory of all things. Inventory is was a favorite word with the Egyptians. The layout of the place and its activities combines heaven and earth, underworld, all in one all-embracing scheme, as Verlaine calls it, a scale model of the universe, which is what I always call the temple. Dershain describes the temple as a point of emergence of God's power on earth, the building itself being, as we've often pointed out, after the pattern of the universe, a scale model. An unfailing high point of the great assembly in all its glory is the creation hymn. The situation with its overpowering magnificence, which the Egyptians seem to have caught on better to than any other people, may be briefly described in the Leiden Solar Litany. Ammon is the hidden one, the first to emerge into existence. Rising as Re, from the noon he became young again, and Shu and Tefnut joined him. Mounting the throne of his desire, he gained dominance over all that existed. He assumed the kingship of eternity, the sole Lord, bursting forth in glory on the first. This idea of bursting forth the weapon is something like a big bang. Comes suddenly bang with a burst of light that just staggers everything. Bursting forth in glory on the first occasion, as we could say, big bang. All beings were struck dumb by his glory. All ears began to hear. All eyes began to see. His thunderous voice went forth broadcast. He gave birth to all that exists. He caused all to live. He made all men to know the path to walk in so they could be like him. From the pyramid text through the new kingdom, royal creation motif was central. I am Atom along with noon. I am Re, the first that is rising. Well, all things are brought together in orderly fashion in this great panegyric. We won't go into that, where everything is in motion and so forth. The grandiose activities of the assembly require a cosmological. You must bring the cosmology in. This is very important. It relates the individual. This is back to hypocephalus again, you see. It relates the individual to his place in the universe. It gives us the various degrees and powers among the stars and so forth and how they're distributed and the like. It's required a cosmological setting, as Ashman calls a consistent cycle of liturgical, cosmographical, and cultic elements which put man into the order of the eternities, of cosmic, Getterweltness, and ambience, that we fit ourselves in, you see. Reviewing Ashman's study, Barta points out that a thorough knowledge of the familiar figures would be all important to an Egyptian salvation. He had to have a handbook to follow, something just exactly like our hypocephalus, incidentally, that is not only instructing him regarding the apes and the crews of the ship, but also know the secret metamorphoses of the sun god and the stations of his circle. These had to be known because, quote, because being initiated and possessing the correct knowledge of everything around them was viewed by the Egyptian as an uncompromising imperative in all fields of knowledge. Indeed, the Book of the Dead itself gives us the cosmos as a whole, one elementary universal structure which is mythically presented in the form of a series of pictures. For instruction, for the dead must possess a compendium of all knowledge, and that's what these compendiums are for. It is not a case of this world or another, as Brunner shows us, but rather a closed system, a self-contained life system which produced a 3,000-year endurance of a culture, and in which we are all embraced, the one, you see. Well, let's summarize some of the most important developments. It's good this wasn't scheduled for 1 hour. Oh, brother. Here we go, then. The Egyptian notation, this is just one page. Can you suffer? No. No, it doesn't go on like that, no. That would be cruel and unusual punishment. Well, I'm going to skip down. The light comes from above, the corpse. The light comes from above into the darkness. Well, we can show some more slides. Give us some more slides. Those toward the end there. This is often represented. And we don't want that one. Horrible battle scene. Give us another one. Quick. Ta-da. Yeah, well, I got it upside down. You couldn't turn that around, could you? You see what happens? The light is going down. Give us the next one. It'll probably be right. Because there are hundreds of these. That's upside. They're all upside down. Give us the next one. It may be upside down. The light comes from below, up above. Well, here's one coming above here. The light coming above. Give us the next one. That'll probably be right. Yeah, well, here's one that's finally right. You see, the light comes down from above, down from the corpse below, and animates it. And that's the spirit coming down. It comes down from above to the corpse lying inert in the darkness of the tomb. It is Re coming down to Osiris. It is the deceased's own spirit coming down from above to unite with his body, so that the two, becoming a single person, may mount up together from the place. The central theme, writes Barta, is the relationship between the deceased and the sun god in all of his forms of appearance. That is the identity of the dead with both Re and Osiris. He's identical with both the sun up above and the body on the couch. The hymns hail Re as the Ba and Osiris as the corpse, which must be united with a complete personality. They meet and fuse. This fusion is first mentioned in the Litany of the Sun, found in the tomb of Nefertari at the time of Ramses III. It is described as the final result of a long, strenuous mental effort culminating in the royal tomb. Yet the doctrine is found flourishing at all times, and we can see it. Proves it. Well, I go through some cases from the pyramid text here, from the coffin text, and from the famous Book of the Dead, chapter 17 of the Book of the Dead. There's another one here. This is what happens. I am the double Ba. I am the one who absorbs the other. I come down. Well, this is what happens. What can this mean? I'm quoting it. It is Osiris when he entered into Mendes. Now, Mendes is the place where this takes place, and there he found the Ba of Re. Thereupon the two embraced each other. Thereupon they became a double, and the one melded into the other as the double bearer, the receiver of Horus, the deliverer of his father. Finally, in the late period from the tomb of Perosiris, hail to Osiris, Lord of Abydos, Lord of Mendes. Thoth speaks the ordinances for your glorification. I come to you. I am Horus. I protect you. I cause you to live. We can't bring the sun in, and so forth. So, when Re descends into the darkness, he contemplates the form of Osiris for a while. Then we have other pictures. Well, facsimile 1 in the Book of Abraham. That's as good as any. There's it is again, you see. But it shows it coming down from heaven there. Facsimile 1, where you see the bird above Abraham. Descends into the darkness, he contemplates the form of Osiris for a while, and then places himself upon it, fusing up to a single person. In the infinitesimal fraction of a second in which they two touch as separate persons, a spark leaps between them. It jump-starts the new life cycle. For that reason, the contact must take place at a particular instance. That's the only time when the sun, moon, stars are all in the right position to begin their cycles anew. When conditions are right for jumping onto the merry-go-round, that's where merry-go-rounds come from, incidentally, as the expression goes in the hypocephaly, becoming the follower or the attendant of Re in his celestial. You jump on by becoming the follower of Re. If you can join in his company or in his host, you'll get to heaven with him. But you must make that one moment at the beginning of the new year. Well, when Re descends, he changes his hawk's head to a ram's head. Throughout the ancient literature, the head of the ram dominates absolutely. This comes when you come to hypocephaly stuff. This scenario is not something brought to light by new doctors. It's been there all along. The story is told in countless written texts, but no texts are more enlightening than the inscriptions on the hypocephaly, which we'll consider next. We'll finally get to them next time. But I'm sorry to have inflicted this on you this way. Let's call it off. Any questions? No, that's good. I'm sure I've answered all questions. No. So thank you very much.